I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm taking you through the wonderful Westminster Abbey in search of its most interesting oddities. Welcome to Westminster Abbey, one of the most celebrated places of worship in the world. While it isn't the oldest church in the UK or even in London, it is a deeply fascinating place, filled with history dating back to around the year 960, when it was founded here on a marshy land where the Tyburn River met the Thames. In the 13th century, the late 11th century church, built under Edward the Confessor, was completely rebuilt under the reign of Henry III, and we'll see a lot of evidence of that a little bit later on. Since this building's consecration in 1065, it's been the site of 40 coronations and the burial site for 18 English, Scottish, and British monarchs, as well as at least 16 royal weddings. And it's also one of the most popular tourist attractions in the country. It was heaving with people, pilgrims and tourists alike, when I was here. However, as visitors are dazzled by the most famous tombs and stunning statuary, they often miss the truly weird and wacky oddities found inside. And so that is what I'm going to show you today. During busy times at Westminster Abbey, you're encouraged to walk through in a large figure 8 pattern. So that is the order of our tour today. I'm going to tell you about these objects and places in the order that you're likely to encounter them when you visit. If you're new to my channel, I just want to say welcome. I give meticulously researched tours of wonderful, strange, and interesting museums in London and, increasingly, other cities around the world, so you can check out my channel. For my regular viewers, I've recently launched a Patreon where I'm sharing all kinds of extra content on a regular basis, including one extra video tour every month. I recently shared a patrons-only tour of the Wellcome Medical Collection, and coming soon, I'll be doing some interesting things for the spooky Halloween season. We're moving now through the North Porch and then down the North Aisle. We're on our way to one of the most unusual burials in the Abbey, but just a quick note here. A lot of people are surprised to find out that Charles Darwin is interred here at Westminster Abbey. That's because his theories of evolution are so often positioned as being at odds with Christianity and religion in general. So it might surprise you to find out that, though he was agnostic, Darwin was highly respected by not only his peers, but by the church. The Bishop of Carlisle, Harvey Goodwin, said of his burial here, "It would have been unfortunate if anything had occurred to give weight and currency to the foolish notion that there is a necessary conflict between a knowledge of nature and a belief in God." Nearby, you'll also find Sir Isaac Newton and even the ashes of Stephen Hawking, amongst many other world-changing scientists. It seems science, or at very least scientists, are very welcome in this house of God. But here we are at the burial site of Ben Jonson. Did you know that more than 3,000 people are buried inside Westminster Abbey? It's true. After all, it was a real honor to be buried here near nobility, kings and queens, instead of in the traditional churchyard, and people were willing to pay handsomely for it. So if you could afford the high fees, you could secure a final resting place inside this most famous abbey. Due to the fame of the figures buried here, artist William Morris described the abbey as a, quote, national Valhalla. But for dramatist and poet Ben Jonson, here he is in the National Portrait Gallery. He died with a dodgy financial situation in 1637, and so being buried at Westminster Abbey, though it was his dream, seemed like a no-go. That is, until he realized he could afford a place here, but one so small that nobody believed he would fit. It was only 18 inches by 18 inches. He famously told the dean, quote, 6 feet long by 2 feet wide is too much for me. 2 feet by 2 feet will do for all I want. I don't know why he became a bit transatlantic there. And so he was buried vertically. Now, I know that this sounds like an urban legend, and you know that I love urban legends, and I love debunking them even more. But this one, my friends, is 100% true. See, in 1859, workmen were tasked with moving John Hunter's body. Yes, that's Hunter of the Hunterian Museum, who I have a great video about. from the vaults at St. Martin's in the Fields, which were closing. He'd been previously interred there in 1753. When placing his body here in Westminster Abbey and laying down the elaborate brass plaque, they accidentally disturbed Jonson's grave, which was right next to it. Jonson's head came tumbling out of the grave, a hank of red hair still attached. And according to people who were there that day, Jonson's head was passed around freely for a few hours before it was placed back in his vertical grave. Yes, he was indeed standing up. Now you can see his original marker just over here on the wall. They moved it at that same time. It says, "O rare Ben Jonson," which is a little bit of a play on words, a pun for this wordsmith. "O rare Ben Jonson" can also look like "O rare Ben Jonson," which means pray for him. So a little bit of a double entendre. By the way, the Abbey no longer charges for the honor of being interred here. But that does also mean you can't buy your way in anymore. So I've really got no chance. I didn't have a chance with the money anyway. Now, as we make our way down the north aisle, past the memorial to the unknown warrior, and then back up the south aisle, it's a great time to see this unusual example of financial stress. See, as I mentioned, much of the modern abbey was built in the 13th century under King Henry III. But when he died in 1272, it wasn't completed, and he had been a lavish overspender. There simply wasn't enough money left in the coffers to continue with the kind of luxuries that he was including. That means that King Richard II had to complete it without a ton of money to do so. And he cut some corners. We can see that exact spot where he made a tough choice right here. You can see the transition from a fancy floral pattern, which is called diapering, to a stripped back and much cheaper plain surface. By the way, the abbey was finally finished by King Richard II in the late 14th century. Both Henry III and Richard II are both buried here. Now here is the wonderful tomb to a 17th century scoundrel who I absolutely love talking about. I think I'm going to make a Patreon video about Thomas Thynn. Now Thomas Thynn was at the heart of the biggest murder scandal of the 17th century. He was murdered on Pall Mall in a drive-by shooting by 3 men in a carriage, ordered by the wealthy Swedish count who was the lover of his 14-year-old secret wife, Lady Elizabeth Percy. Thynn was good friends with the Duke of Monmouth, one of Charles II's illegitimate sons, and they were driving down Haymarket in his stylish carriage when he was shot dead. Thynn later had a very evocative popular ballad written about him. Here lies Tom Thynn of Longleat Hall, who ne'er would have miscarried, had he married the woman he slept withal, or slept with the woman he married. This story is brilliant, and the tomb is sculpted by Arnold Quellen. Now we're in St. Michael's Chapel, which is located just off the north transept. It is filled with elaborate monuments and tombs. I mean, for instance, check out Francis Vere here. He was a soldier under Elizabeth I, and I absolutely love his tomb. It really reminds me of the effigy tombs popular at the time in Burgundy, France. I include one in my video about unusual things to see in the Louvre. I'm talking about the tomb of Philip Pot. Of course, this one here is a little more regal and less spooky. But here is a monument that takes my breath away. Just wow. Poor Elizabeth Nightingale died in 1731 after delivering a stillborn premature baby, and her husband was so bereft that he spent the next 30 years planning a special memorial for her. Some say that she was shocked by a flash of lightning and that hastened her death. We can see the beautiful Elizabeth dying, and her husband is trying to protect her from death, who has his deadly spear aimed right at her. Of course, we know that her husband would not succeed. The spear evokes the lightning that her family believed contributed to her death. In the years afterwards, Elizabeth's brother-in-law had a terrifying nightmare in which a skeleton appeared at the end of his bed and skittered up under the covers, snuggling in between he and his wife. The idea was relayed to the artist. Louis-François Roubiliac was a French sculptor living in London at the time. Now, Death has somehow lost his lower jaw, but I think he's all the more frightening for it. His gnashing maw is even more exposed. By the way, the chapel is missing an unusual artifact. Apparently a thief broke into the abbey late one night, but the sculpture scared him so badly that he dropped his crowbar. It used to be displayed alongside the tomb, but it has disappeared. This is truly one of my favorite things in the Abbey, and it will feature in my sequel to the most macabre things in London's churches, which I am releasing in time for this Halloween 2024. Here we are at the John Islip Chapel. John Islip was an abbot of Westminster from 1500 to 1532, and he gets a very prestigious side chapel as a result. But let's look up here above the entrance to his chapel. We can see this little human eye and a bundle of branches. This is what's known as a rebus. That's a pictorial pun on a name or a place. The eye that is next to the branch, which was known as a slip, represents Islip. Get it? People love puns. I love walking through all the side chapels that line the ambulatory. They're home to so many stunning and lavish tombs that hold the remains of aristocrats and nobles. But if you are into seeing unusual effigies, and I know you are, I think you will appreciate that of Frances Sidney, Countess of Sussex, in the Chapel of St. Paul. She was a lady of the bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth I, and she founded Sidney Sussex College at Cambridge. Now let's scan the rest of the room. I mean, these are the kinds of animal companions that we usually see in a medieval or Tudor-era church. Lambs, dogs, even dragons. But Frances is blessed with a big old blue and gold porcupine at her feet. Look up, and there are also two on top of her tomb. Why a blue porcupine? Well, it comes from the family crest of the Sidney family. It was added to the family's crest when William Sidney traveled to France to assist in the marriage between Princess Mary, Henry VIII's sister, and King Louis XII. He was given the name the Jousting Ambassador, which I think is one heck of a title. And you can kind of see the spiny, spiking connection between a porcupine and somebody jousting. Porcupines also featured on the French king's coat of arms, symbolizing tenacity and bravery. Just don't let your dog near one. We're now in the ambulatory surrounding Edward the Confessor's tomb. Here we can see the tomb of Henry III. Now remember, he was the king who died in 1272 after overspending on this very building. He clearly spent a lot on this tomb and effigy, which is made of Purbeck marble and sides laid with gilded mosaic. However, have a closer look. These pretty and expensive mosaic tiles are missing. All the ones within arm's reach, you might notice. Yes, over time, pilgrims to the Abbey throughout the centuries have swiped a tile to take home as a memento. Human nature doesn't change, my friends. Here is another tomb, the one holding the remains of Edward I, or Edward Longshanks, infamous for his incursions into Scotland, where he was known as the Hammer of the Scots. However, you'll notice that he is buried here in a very plain tomb. No gold, no effigy, no markers, no monuments. That's strange in and of itself. But why? Edward I, who was Henry III's son, ruled from 1272 to 1307. He was also the first king to regularly call Parliament and the first to title his son the Prince of Wales, a tradition that, you may know, continues to this day. So why is his tomb so plain? Well, it seems that Edward may have requested that his bones be buried in the Holy Land when it was inevitably reconquered after the Ninth Crusade, and so this should only be his temporary tomb, and thus it only needed to be very plain. He, of course, proved to be overly confident, and he remains here to this day. Here in the Innocents' Corner is a simple white urn that contains the skeletal remains of two young children discovered in the Tower of London during some maintenance work in 1674. Charles II then ordered that they be interred here. The bodies are thought to belong to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, who are together referred to as the Princes in the Tower. That's because they are rumored to have been murdered in 1483 at the behest of Richard III, who viewed them as obstacles in his desire for the throne. I mean, we all know he isn't here. Richard III ended up in a car park for the longest time, not the hallowed surrounds of Westminster Abbey. I talked at length about these princes in my video on the Tudors in the National Portrait Gallery. They are featured in part 1, and I've linked it just above if you'd like to learn more about their lives and suspected murder. Thankfully, Westminster Abbey escaped much damage during the Blitz bombings of 1940 and 1941, but there is a little bit of damage if you know where to look. I'm standing out in front of the 16th century Lady Chapel right now, one of the most beautiful places in the entire abbey, on the inside. But here, a high explosive bomb landed nearby in September 1940, shattering many stained glass windows and poking holes in the fabric of the building. One of these holes has been preserved by placing a piece of glass over the top, a reminder of the horrors of war. You can see it here just above me. We're now back inside the Lady Chapel, and you can also see the hole here beside the Royal Air Force flag. Owing to its visible connection to the Blitz, this small chapel has now been dedicated to the Royal Air Force. There's Blitz bomb damage all over London. I feature it in a lot of my different videos. Good old Oliver Cromwell. For some 10 years and change, this puritanical leader ruled the country as its Lord Protector, and when he died in 1658, he was interred here at Westminster Abbey. Here is one of his portraits at the National Portrait Gallery. Despite not taking the title, he ruled like a king in life, so why not be buried here with great kings in death? His original burial was here in Henry VII's chapel, though there was no pomp and ceremony that went against his Puritan beliefs. However, his interment here wouldn't be for long. Now, of course, the strangest thing about this burial plaque is not the plaque itself, it's what happened to poor Oliver Cromwell. Well, I shouldn't say poor, some would argue he brought it on himself, because after he ruled as Lord Protector of England in the interregnum after the execution of Charles I, when Charles II retook the crown, he decided to exact his revenge on this man. Too bad the man was already dead, right? Well, wrong. Charles II ordered that Oliver Cromwell's body be exhumed from Westminster Abbey. He put the corpse on trial, found the corpse guilty of treason, and had it beheaded, and the head placed on a spike outside the Palace of Westminster, also known as the Houses of Parliament today. I plan to do a video on the interesting journey that Oliver Cromwell's head took throughout time coming up for my Patreon members. So please become a patron if you'd be more interested in that. Also, I have a video about the strange executions in London that you might be interested in as well. A small stone was placed here in 1949 by the Cromwell Association so that his name could be seen by visitors, and it records his very brief burial, 1658 to 1661. Just in case you are a big fan of Oliver Cromwell, don't worry, he's still here. He has his own statue outside the Westminster Great Hall, just across the street from Westminster Abbey. Remember a little while ago I mentioned Sydney Sussex College, founded by Sydney Sussex of the Blue Porcupine? Well, we have another strange connection for our tour. That's actually where Oliver Cromwell's head has ended up. Yes, after the 17th and 18th century, when his dried out head became a bit of an oddity passed around to various private collectors and museums, in 1960 it was officially buried at Sydney Sussex College, which was Cromwell's alma mater. Check out these little ledges. They're called Misericords, and these ones are designed with some decidedly secular images. But what is a misericord? Well, in abbeys and churches that have been home or are currently home to monastic orders, the monks are not allowed to sit down during services. And so a misericord or a misery bench was designed so that they could have a little bit of a cheat and take some weight off of their feet. So as a small nod to ease there, misery, they would sometimes add a small carved seat to the underside of the choir stall, so you could kind of lean on it. These are sometimes called a mercy seat or a pity seat. That way you can rest your weary rear end on the seat even when it's flipped up. Genius! It's a perfect loophole. Strangely, carvers were known to decorate these misericords with secular or downright profane images, even though they were for religious orders. It's almost like the fact this was a little bit of a loophole, a little bit of a cheat, gave them permission to take things a bit further and play a practical joke. It was almost like this was a way of knowing that the monks were human just like them. And some of these can get pretty racy, especially here in the Henry VII Chapel. The artisans seemed to like this reminder that the monks were only human. You could see a wife beating, or some can even say flogging, her husband, which may have been intended to remind the clergy that there were many positives to celibacy. And you can also see dragons and devils, and in this case, here's a preening mermaid. You'll also find pagan images on the misericords, such as the Green Man. I also have to mention that I found this wonderful website, Misericords of the World. Remember, folks, if you have a weird special interest, you're never alone. Okay, this one's really cool. Now here is one of my favorite statues in the entire abbey, that of Wilgefortis, which likely derives from the Latin Virgo Fortis, courageous virgin. She's a female folk saint that became popular in the 14th century, and she's known for her big bushy beard. She looks kind of like my husband. According to her hagiography, she was a Portuguese teen born to a noble family, and she was promised in marriage by her father to a Moorish king. To get out of this, she took a vow of virginity and prayed that God would make her repulsive to behold. In answer to her prayers, she miraculously sprouted a beard, which served its purpose perfectly. Her fiancé was indeed repulsed. However, her father, in his anger, then had her crucified, which... I mean, I can understand grounding her, but crucified? Not great. So while we call her Wilgefortis or Wilgefortis now, she was once referred to in England and in the Low Countries as uncumber. That is, she was a saint who could help with unencumbering, especially from an abusive husband. Interestingly, she was never officially canonized by the church, so her inclusion here in this chapel is definitely strange. It's not just her beard that makes her an oddity. Now, this statue really caught my eye because of the skull, of course. This is Elizabeth Russell here in the chapel of St. Edmond. She was one of Elizabeth I's maids of honor, but she sadly died young in 1601. She's decked out in the fashions of the day, including a sumptuous ruff. She's next to her father's monument, and she's carved from alabaster and marble, seated in a wicker chair with her foot resting on the skull. Because she's pointing to the skull, this gave rise to the legend that she died of an infection after pricking her finger, but this isn't true. She died of consumption or tuberculosis. The Latin inscription reads, "She is not dead, but sleepeth. Sacred to the happy memory of Elizabeth Russell, her afflicted sister Anne has erected this monument." And of course, the skull is a memento mori, there to remind us that we too shall die, and we should live a pious and deserving life. We're here in the so-called Poets' Corner, and monuments to Shakespeare, another monument to Ben Jonson, the Bronte sisters, and so many other great writers. However, here we have another unusual tombstone embedded into the floor. Most people were buried in the graveyard of their local parish church, but not old Tom Parr. And I do mean old. We can see that his tombstone says that he was born in 1483, lived through the reigns of 10 monarchs, and then was buried here in 1635. His life was chronicled in a 1635 pamphlet called The Old, Very Old Man, or The Age and Long Life of Thomas Parr. Let's be honest, we do think that most people must have been confusing Tom Parr with his father, or even his grandfather. He ate a diet of green cheese, onions, buttermilk, coarse bread, and mild ale, and he didn't smoke. By the way, green cheese wasn't actually spoiled or rotten. In some interpretations of this story, it does say he ate spoiled cheese, but green cheese also can just mean young cheese, like that pictured here. Tom's personal motto was, "Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut." And I think that's great advice. I should follow it more often, really. In 1635 he travelled to London from Shropshire to see Charles I. Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, had heard of him and thought he'd make a real splash in the court, and he did. He was painted both by Rubens and Van Dyck. Old Tom was only here in London for a few weeks before he took ill and passed away. It's blamed usually on his rich diet and also on the pollution of London itself, but it's far more likely that he just caught a virus that he was unfamiliar with while he was here. We are now upstairs in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Gallery, and one of the first objects I noticed was this Roman sarcophagus. During a Victorian excavation of the sacristy, that is, the area of the abbey where vestments were stored, archaeologists uncovered early medieval burials lined with stones, as well as this Roman sarcophagus, which had been reused for a medieval burial, most likely in the 11th century. It's actually more common than you think to find Roman objects repurposed in London, sometimes used for coffins and sometimes used for horse drinking troughs and even building materials. My favorite artifacts held here in the church. These are the funeral effigies of 21 different monarchs and nobles, so legendary in their own right that there's entire books written just about these. Some are made from wood and some wax, and they tell a fascinating story. They remind me of the puppets and automatons that I featured in the Strange Paris Museums video that I've linked above. There are 21 funeral effigies on display here, dating from the 14th to the early 17th centuries. But first, what is a funeral effigy? Well, here on my channel we talk a lot about effigies, both those held in museums and also located in churches. They are sculptural representations of the dead located on top of a tomb. However, in these cases, these are temporary sculptures used for the funeral procession, placed on top of the coffin and then topped with a canopy. We aren't familiar with these because they are no longer common. In fact, they haven't really been commonly used since the 17th century. I mean, it would have caused quite a commotion had Elizabeth II's procession, televised all over the world, featured a statue of her body. We have a very different relationship with death and grieving today than people did in the past. Many of these funeral effigies are made from the death masks of the person who died. And this particular effigy was created by the same sculptor who used the death mask to create this sculpture of Henry VII held by the Victoria and Albert Museum. I'll be releasing a video about death masks this October, so be sure to subscribe if you want to be notified about that. I'm visiting tons of museums to get the real story. Early effigies here are made from wood with gesso and plaster faces, while later effigies have wax heads. Until the early 20th century, many were displayed next to the monarch's tomb. During a bombing raid in 1941, the water used to put out the fires destroyed many of the bodies that were made of straw and plaster, but some were later restored. Let's have a look at a few of the effigies. Here is the earliest of Edward III, buried in 1377, and this is also created from his death mask. Elizabeth of York was one of those destroyed by water, and now only her pear wood head and arms survive. But here you can see her granddaughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I. This one was remade in 1760, but the corset is original. James I's effigy and that of his son Henry the Prince of Wales lost their heads, sadly, but Anne of Denmark survives, and her face was also taken from her death mask. Now look at this natty fellow. Charles II, one of my favorite kings to talk about. Now this is not actually a funeral effigy. The custom had died out by 1685, pun intended, but this wax effigy was cast to stand by his grave in the Henry VII chapel, and it even wears silk underwear. Charles II, because of his conversion to Catholicism, doesn't have an elaborate tomb here in the Abbey, so this wax effigy stood in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, some of these effigies, like William II and Mary II, seen here in their portraits at the National Portrait Gallery, were actually purchased for the explicit purposes of showing them off. That's because the Abbey's choirmen could earn a bit of extra money by showing off waxworks to the public. Madame Tussaud was onto something. I mean, her museum is popular to this day, so I can really see the appeal. These funeral effigies are my absolute favorite thing inside Westminster Abbey. I came around the corner here and had to do a double take. A woman was standing just in front of one of these glass cases, and I honestly thought that she had come alive. Like Kim Cattrall in Mannequin, or today's special for any of my Canadian viewers. Let's have a look at this wax effigy of Frances Teresa, Duchess of Richmond and Lennox. I don't necessarily want to talk about her effigy, though it is beautiful and interesting, but I want to talk about her pet parrot. Beside her wax effigy, we can see her African grey parrot on a stand. It lived with her for 40 years and died very soon after, which means that this taxidermied parrot dates to the very early 18th century, making it potentially the oldest stuffed bird in existence that still survives. And may I say, it's in fantastic condition. I talk about another taxidermized parrot in my video about the strangest pubs in London. That's Polly in the Old Cheshire Cheese. Here is the coronation chair used for the crowning of Mary II, who was the only monarch to share her throne equally with her spouse, William III. Though she had the direct claim to the throne, they were first cousins, and they both had claim to the throne. And after William overthrew her father, James II, she really wanted him to rule on his own, but it was agreed they should be joint sovereigns, with William remaining as the sole monarch should she die before him. Because two monarchs were being crowned at the same time, a second chair needed to be created. William used the ancient chair, and a new one. This one was created for her. Now, the first thing you might notice is that it is covered in graffiti. Yes, vandals have carved their names into this chair. The other, more famous coronation chair has also fallen prey to graffiti. It's the result of Westminster schoolboys and 18th and 19th century visitors. One cheeky tourist even carved, P. Abbott slept in this chair, 5th-6th July, 1800, onto the famous seat. I've said it before, and I will certainly say it again. Human nature hasn't changed. Now here's another interesting quirk. Here is the oldest door in Westminster Abbey, and maybe even in England. This was part of the original Westminster Abbey, built by Edward the Confessor in the 1050s, and we can prove that with science. Dendrochronology, that is the study of the aging of wood, reveals that this tree was still growing between 924 and 1030, and so they think that this door dates to sometime around 1050, making it very nearly 1,000 years old, and the oldest in England. Good job, door. Now, I love this little comet-shaped memorial stone to astronomer Edmond Halley, located in the South Cloisters. He successfully predicted the reappearance of the comet that now has his name every 76 years. I'm dating myself, but I have a vague memory of Halley's comet appearing in 1986, and so let's hope I'm still alive and touring in 2061 when it appears again. Now let's finish our tour of oddities with this familiar face above the western door. My tour guests regularly have to do a double take when they see this statue, because it is none other than the famous civil rights hero Martin Luther King Jr. above the door of Westminster Abbey. Because most of the monuments and memorials in this building are dedicated to people who died centuries ago, and yet here is American civil rights hero Martin Luther King Jr. He's one of the 10 modern martyrs of the 20th century, people of all Christian faiths who gave their lives in the service of others, and these statues were created in 1998 by sculptor Tim Crawley. Well, that's the end of our tour. I hope you've enjoyed spending time in Westminster Abbey as much as I have, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.